Be careful with how much you keep yourself a secret. Mysteries can be dangerous.
Thank you for clicking on this video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today we are going to be talking about a man named Roland T. Owen. Now, this man was a mystery from the moment he walked into the hotel he was staying at, but when he turned up dead, this mystery turned into a full-blown murder investigation. By the way, I'm doing Suspect Summer all summer long. If you didn't know, I would love to have you stay and subscribe and come back and watch these videos with me if you do enjoy them. And also, if you want a thumbs up, it really makes me happy, makes me smile. Let's get back to the story. So it was January 2nd of 1935, and a man walked into the Hotel President lobby in Kansas City, Missouri. When he walked in, the staff immediately got him what he needed, talked to him at the front desk, but they also noticed that he was a very tall man. He had a scar on the side of his face, and he also had a cauliflower ear, which is basically a deformity of the ear. I'll put a picture in here so you can see what that looks like. But he basically asked for a room. He asked for one several floors above the lobby, and one supposedly facing the courtyard instead of the street. They gave him room 1046. So of course the staff gave him the key, and he signed in as Roland T. Owen from Los Angeles, California, and they gave him the key to his room, and he was about to head up when the bellboy actually decided to join him. The bellboy's name was Randolph Probst. This man, who had just got a room at this hotel, who was just going to stay for one night, did not have any luggage whatsoever. So basically this bellhop went with him just to keep him company and unlock the door for him, just as kind of like a kind thing to do. They made small talk on their walk, and Roland actually was telling the bellhop that the hotel president was not his first choice. He actually wanted to stay at the Muhlenbach, and why he didn't was because the fees were too high there at $5 a night, which, side note, can you imagine staying in a hotel for $5 a night? But he thought that that was just an outrageous amount of money for a hotel, so he decided to go to Hotel President. So when they got to room 1046, bellhop opened the door for Roland. He walked inside, and he took a comb, a brush, and toothpaste out of his black coat that he was wearing, and he placed them in the bathroom. He then turned and headed out the door with the bellhop, and the bellhop locked the door behind them, and then they went their separate ways. Roland actually left the hotel, and the bellhop went back to his duties. It is unknown where Roland was headed at this time, and he actually entered the hotel again without notice from any of the staff, which seems to be exactly what he wanted. But later that day, when Roland was back, a maid actually went to go around doing her cleaning duties and went to room 1046 and knocked on the door. Roland, of course, answered it and said she could come in, but to leave the door unlocked, whether she was coming in or going out, because he was expecting a visitor. When she entered, she noticed that the room was very dark, the curtains were drawn, and there was only one lamp illuminating the entire room. She noticed right away that Roland seemed very anxious or nervous about something, but before she could get the chance to ask him, she did all of her duties, and when she was done, he was actually gone. So she left, leaving the door unlocked like he had asked, even though he was no longer in the room. After that, she went along with her duties, and about 4 p.m. she went back to that room with fresh towels. It hadn't been that long since she had actually left the room, but when she came back, the door was still unlocked, and she walked right in and saw Roland actually laying on the bed now, fully clothed. She had also noticed while she was putting the towels away that there was a note now on the table. It actually said, "Dawn, I'll be back in 15 minutes. Wait." But again, she left him alone. The next time anyone saw Roland was at 10:30 the next morning of January 3rd, when the maid came in to clean again. She noticed that the door was locked from the outside because she could only get in using her pass key. So she used her pass key, got inside, and noticed that Roland was sitting again in the dark, now in a chair, facing forward, motionless. She didn't really say much. She was really freaked out, so she went about her duties, tried to get the cleaning done as soon as possible, when in the middle of the silence the phone rang. Roland picked up the phone, listened to what the man or person on the other side said, and then he said, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I already had breakfast." And the maid just kind of tried to mind her own business while listening into this conversation. After that, he immediately hung up the phone and turned towards the maid. The maid was a little taken aback by this and just kind of stood there waiting for whatever Roland was going to say. He started quizzing her on the hotel itself, on Hotel President, and also asking her what her duties were at this hotel. The maid kind of answered the best she could and then got out of there as quick as she could. But it took a while before she could leave because Roland continued to ask her questions, and also, just like he told the other bellhop, that he wanted to stay at the other hotel, but he couldn't because of the price. But eventually she did get to leave. So that's when she took the dirty towels in the room and she left Roland in the dark. But a few hours later, she knew that she had to bring back fresh towels into the room because it was her job. So she went and she knocked on the door of room 1046, and this time the room was locked from the inside. When she called out for Roland that she had fresh towels for him, another voice answered. It was much rougher and deeper than Roland's had been, and told her that they were fine, that they didn't need towels. She knew this was untrue because she was the one who took the old towels and there was none in the room. But at this point, she was done with the strange behavior and she just went ahead and left. Around 7 a.m. the next morning of January 4th, the telephone operator of the hotel noticed that the phone was off the hook in room 1046. But she didn't want to disturb anyone in there, so they waited about 3 hours. And through this whole time, the phone was still off the hook, which back then you had to have it on the hook to turn it off and to end the phone call. So eventually the operator sent the bellhop, the one that had actually brought Roland to this room, ran off, and once he got there, the door was locked, so he called out to Roland to see if he was okay. He said that he needed to put the phone back on the hook, and Roland called out saying, "Come in." So Randolph, the bellhop, tried. He opened the door, and it was locked. So again, he called out, "You need to put the phone back on the hook." And then Roland called out saying, "Turn the lights on." But the bellhop couldn't. He couldn't get in. He was so confused, but he kept knocking, and there was no voice that was coming again. So eventually the bellhop just left to do his other bellhop duties. And an hour and a half later, it was still off the hook, so the telephone operator sent the other bellhop named Harold to go fix the problem. This time he took his pass key, and when nobody answered and it was still locked, he actually put the pass key in the door and walked in room 1046. He saw an outline of Roland actually on the bed. He looked naked, but Harold didn't look too closely. He just walked over to where the phone stand was, he set it back up, and he put the phone back on the hook and left. They thought that this solved their problem, but there was far more going on than they could ever expect. Harold left the drunken man, what seemed to be just a man completely out of his mind, drunken from the night before, wasn't really coherent of what was happening. He left him on the bed, and he just walked out just like the other bellhop had done. But shortly after, the phone was off the hook again. And so the first bellhop, Randolph, went back up, used his passkey just as Harold had done, and walked in the door. But what he saw was Roland naked, crouched in his room with his hands up to his bloodied head. Immediately, the bellhop flipped on the lights and saw blood everywhere, all over the walls and all over the room. Now the bellhop, of course, ran to the assistant manager, who called the police, and as soon as the police got there, they noticed that Roland had drug himself from the bed to the bathroom in an attempt to get a drink. He had been repeatedly stabbed and had a fractured skull. His neck was bruised, and this led police to believe that he was strangled and tied up, and the blood splatter showed that where he had been stabbed in the lung was actually done when he was in bed. But Roland was still conscious, barely conscious though, and when the police asked him what had happened, he said he fell against the bathtub. But this room looked like a full-on torture chamber. and Roland was not doing well. And the room already showed that that was not the truth whatsoever, that somebody else was involved in this. And so when Roland wouldn't or couldn't give them the answers they were wanting, they needed to full-on search this room for any clues themselves. But the room itself was just as strange as this crime scene. All of the usual hotel things like shampoo, soaps, towels were all completely gone, and so was every stitch of possible clothing. This man, Roland, did not walk into the hotel with a bag, but he was wearing clothes, and they were nowhere to be found. Other than the usual hotel furniture, there were only little things about the room that they found. There was a label from a tie, an unsmoked cigarette, a safety pin, a hairpin, and there was a small bottle of sulfuric acid. There was also small pieces of a cord, which was thought to have been the one used to tie Roland up. But the actual cord themselves and the weapon used to stab him were nowhere to be seen. On the way to the hospital, Roland fell into a coma, and the police were searching frantically for any possible persons involved because, as they said, someone was mixed up in all of this. They came to the conclusion that about 6 hours before they were called, a little after midnight, that this man had been tortured by someone. And shortly after midnight of the next night, he died in the hospital. And this turned into a full-blown murder investigation. So they retraced his footsteps, or tried to. They backtracked through that night before he was murdered and tried to get all the possible clues that they could. A man named Robert Lane came forward saying that that night at about 11 p.m. he had been driving downtown heading home when he saw a man just in pants and an undershirt running through the streets. This was weird because it was winter, the man was running, and he also wasn't wearing much clothing. Then it got even weirder when this man started flagging Robert down. He stopped and pulled over, and when the man approached, he realized that this man wasn't a taxi driver and asked if he could take him to where taxis were. Robert said yes, and the man got in, and Robert immediately noticed that he had a wound on his arm. Robert said, "Man, you look like you've been in it bad," and the man in the back of his car replied, "I'll kill that beep tomorrow." I don't know what that beep stands for because the newspapers back then really didn't put any explicit content like that, so I'm assuming some sort of cuss word. But it definitely seemed to Robert like this man wanted revenge and knew who had done this to him. Robert and this man went their separate ways that night, but when the news broke of this murder, Robert came forward to the police and identified the man that was in the back of his car as Roland T. Owen. After that, they started investigating the hotel and the guests within it. The day before Roland's murder, a woman named Jean Owen had checked into the hotel and was placed in the room next to his. Now, Jean and Roland had the same last name, but they were not related in any way. But Jean came forward saying that the night that he was murdered, she had actually heard next door arguments happening between a female and two males. It happened throughout the night, and she had almost thought to call the front desk but thought better of it. The last thing she heard was the sound of like a scuffle and then a gasping noise, which almost sounded like somebody just snoring, so she just put it off and went back to sleep. The same night of the murder, a elevator operator at the hotel named Charles Boyker actually confirmed that there was some weird activity that night. He had taken a woman up to the 10th floor who was looking for room 1026 and didn't think much of it because this woman frequented the hotel and was apparently one to go to different rooms with different men. So he took her up there, then he went down, but he was called back up to where she was. She went over to him and she was concerned because the man she was going to meet wasn't there and was nowhere to be seen. And he told her he was going to meet her there. 30 minutes later, he took the woman back down because he couldn't really help her, and the rest of the night he was pretty preoccupied with a noisy party that was happening in room 1055. But about an hour later, he noticed that the same woman came back to the hotel and to the elevator, this time with a man. The woman asked to go to the 9th floor this time, and Charles took them back up. They were actually in the hotel until about 4 a.m. when the woman came down first, and the man followed 15 minutes later. But Charles couldn't identify the man or the woman. The mystery of this whole night was about to get even more confusing because the LA Police Department, where he said he had lived, had no record of a Roland T. Owen in their database. But apparently the only thing they knew about this man, his name, was also a lie. An alias. The night this man died, a woman actually called the police department and said that she thought that he was actually a man from Clinton, Missouri, which was an hour away. But she wanted to remain anonymous, and there was really no lead after that to follow. Several bartenders working the night of his murder said that they had saw a man with his description at the bars with women, and also the hotel of Muhlenbach, which Roland had talked about twice to the staff at Hotel President, actually said that a man looking like him stayed at their hotel the night before he stayed at Hotel President, and he stayed under the name Eugene K. Scott, which also turned out to be an alias. Now before that, he had also stayed at the St. Regis Hotel, still in the same area, with an unknown man. Was it Don? Nobody could figure that out because nobody even knew who Don was. As a last-ditch effort, they published a picture of him in the paper asking, "Do you recognize this man?" They also put his body on public display at the funeral home, hoping that someone would come forward. There were many people that came forward in the area saying that they had seen the man, that they recognized him, but they all gave different names that all seemed to come out as aliases. Nobody knew this real man's identity. Eventually, they had to bury him, and so they decided to put him as dough in a potter's field. But before they could do that, an anonymous donor called the funeral director saying that he was going to pay for a decent burial for this man. He said that this man was actually his sister's fiance, and that Roland T. Owen was his name. He said that he was going to pay so he could get a decent burial, but he wanted to stay anonymous. He also said that Roland just got into a jam and the police were on the wrong track. So he was buried in the Memorial Park Cemetery, and his funeral consisted of only detectives that worked the case. But roses actually showed up at the grave with a card saying, "Love you forever, Louise." Was this his fiance? Another question they didn't know the answer to. So many clues were provided in this case, but none of them made sense, and none of them even went together. This case had the potential to go unsolved for years, but it only took 1 year. I knew you weren't expecting that, were you? Yeah, in 1936, an article in the American Weekly magazine came out of Roland T. Owen and the man that he could be, and asking people if they recognized him. And somebody did. A woman named Eleanor Ogletree. She looked at this picture and thought this man looked a lot like her brother Artemis. He had left their family home in Birmingham, Alabama 1 year before the murder, in April of 1934. He told his family he was going to see the world. Eleanor and their mother Ruby got very suspicious when they started getting letters from Artemis saying that he was sailing for Europe because he did not know how to type. They also got a call from a man named Jordan who said that Artemis had saved his life in Egypt and that he was now married to a wealthy woman. But that is all the contact that they got from Artemis. So the police showed Eleanor and Ruby a picture of Roland T. Owen, and that's all they needed to confirm that this was Artemis Ogletree. They discovered that the letters that they were sent several months after Roland was murdered. But the most shocking part of this all was that Artemis was only 17 years old. So they reopened this case a year later, but not much happened until 2003 when it was reopened again, because a caller actually called the Kansas City Public Library, which housed the records and the archived materials of this case, asking for information about this case. They wouldn't say much. They wanted to be kept anonymous, of course, but they said that they had recently been going through the belongings of someone who had passed away. And they said they found newspaper clippings of this murder and also something that was in the newspaper clippings related to the murder. They wouldn't say much more until they were given more information about the case, and then after that, they didn't say anything. So again, the lead ran dry. So I was so happy to hear that this man got his real name, but this just led to so many more questions. Why was an Alabama man in Kansas City mixed up in all of this craziness? Was he on the run? And if so, from whom? And how in 1 year did all of this happen? And who was Dawn? What did he have to do with it? And if Louise was his fiance, why did she know his fake name and not his real name? And the most boggling question to me is, why in the world would somebody care enough to contact his family after he was murdered? His family wouldn't have known if he was gone, so why did it matter to them that they thought that he was still alive? The most popular theory that I found was that this was some sort of love triangle due to the fact that there was a woman and another man's voice in the room of 1046 that night. But was it Louise? Was it Dawn? Was it Jordan who called Artemis's family? Who was in that room? Who were those people that no one could identify as they left the hotel? It was also speculated that it had something to do with the mob. This could be either he got in trouble with the mob himself, or he fell in love with someone who was involved. Now this was speculated because the mob paid for the funerals of certain victims of theirs. So say if he fell in love with this Louise, whose brother was in the mob, she would have probably forced him to pay for the funeral of this man and at least give him his name. So that would also explain why Artemis Roland wouldn't tell the police anything when they got to the hotel room. If he could utter the words that he fell against the bathtub, he could have easily uttered a name or something to do if he knew the person or what had happened a little bit. But instead he decided to lie and say he fell against a bathtub, which was an obvious blatant lie. And the only reason I could think that that would be reasonable would be if he was scared that he would live and then the mob would come after him for ratting them out. Especially if the woman he was in love with was involved with them, he wouldn't have wanted to get her hurt. So that would make sense as to why he made up a strange random lie. Now to me, I feel like the strange behavior that Roland was putting out was almost like clues for the staff. He continued to say like Muhlenbach to the staff, which is where he stayed at previously, which is the lead they could follow. He continued to say things like Dawn, and when he was on the phone call he said, I don't want to eat breakfast. I am not hungry. I don't want breakfast. I already had breakfast, and made them clear what he was saying. And it just seems to me like somehow in all of this mess he was trying to leave some clues behind without it being too obvious. He didn't want to straight out say, I'm in trouble, I need help, these are the people after me, but he was almost hinting at what had happened. It's also speculated that possibly Dawn was the man who was the anonymous donor that sent the money because he was Louise's brother and Louise was Roland's lover. And that's kind of how it all meshed together. I have no idea. This is one of the most mysterious, strange cases ever. It's technically solved because he has a name, but it's not solved as far as what happened to this poor man in room 1046. Nobody knows. I just had to share this story with you guys. But right now, if you finish this video, I want you to go down below, leave me your best theory, because I need to hear what you guys think. I need to hear your opinions. I need to hear what your best guess at what happened to him, because I don't think we'll ever really find out, which is so sad. But overall, I'm glad that Artemis got to be mourned by his family, and his family got to know, even though he had a very tragic ending. But if you are liking Suspect Summer and want me to continue, please thumbs up this video. It really helps with engagement. Make sure to comment down below, and just to spread my channel so I can continue doing this for you guys. I love you so incredibly much. If you've subscribed, you don't know how much that means to me. I will let you guys go. Bye.
You really never know who a person is, even if they tell you.